Great. Welcome, everyone, to the Center for Global Development. It's exciting to have such a big group on the topic of evidence and development effectiveness in late May here in DC. It's a remarkable group, and I'm going to start in Latin America and with the Inter-American Development Bank, because in some ways the evidence revolution started in that region, and because we have a keynote who is the IDB president, Ilan Goldfajn. Santiago Levy, who is on today's panel, was working at the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. And at that time, this was in 96, 97, excuse me. He worked with Pepe Gomez de Leon and the IDB. We have Ariana Legovini here. We have Carola Alvarez here, who's on the 3IE board, and others to launch Mexico's conditional cash transfer program in 1997. This was inspired by Brazil's Bolsa Escola. And this was one of the first programs in the developing world to be rigorously evaluated. IFPRI academics from Yale and the University of California, Berkeley joined forces, and the rest of the Latin American Caribbean took note. And soon the rest of us, because I was also at the IDB, and so was Marie Gaarder, who's the CEO of 3IE now, Ariana Legovini, who's now the head of DIME and the Impact Evaluation Movement at the World Bank, Ashu Handa, who's the head of the Transfer Project that evaluates cash transfer programs at the UNC North Carolina with UNICEF, Ferdinando Regalia. There were many more. We were all at the IDB during this period working on these big issues. And I think, why was it, I reflect, that evidence and evaluation became so important? Because in the early aughts, cash transfer programs were controversial. And so evaluation was smart to show if and how these programs worked, and if they worked better, if they were more cost-effective than in-kind subsidies, or indeed sector supply-side programs at achieving development goals. Fast forward to 2022, there are cash transfer programs operating in 151 countries around the world. They are absolutely mainstream development, with countries and agencies learning from one another around the world. They've been shown to empower women to get kids health care and education, to transfer humanitarian assistance to reduce poverty, to enable asset accumulation among the poorest. They were essential during COVID-19. But because of the evaluations that we had alongside, we also understand that they're not silver bullets, that their expansion can affect labor market participation, sometimes local markets, and sometimes inflation, which is on everyone's mind these days, although cash transfers are not obviously the main cause. And that their benefits and beneficiaries have to be adjusted to avoid unintended consequences that make people worse off. We know that because of the impact evaluations and the evidence. I think it's a really good example of how an evaluation in one country, led by a small group of people, and happy to have some of those leaders here today, triggered really an evidence revolution and an impact revolution. That led in 2016 to another ex-IDB employee, yes, Ruth Levine, who was then Vice President of Programs, to set up a working group here at the Center for Global Development to ask why other sectors of development went relatively unstudied. And she asked in 2016, together with a group, and I think Santiago Levy was on that group too, called When Will We Ever Learn?, noting that evidence and evaluation on what works is a kind of global public good, and that the diffusion of that information and the potential of rigorous evidence to improve impact or to save money was a development innovation in itself. So from that 2016 CGD working group, 3IE was born, and we mark their 15th anniversary today. So happy birthday to the board of directors and to the CEO of 3IE. In this same period, DIME at the World Bank grew. The academic titans of impact evaluation, JPAL and IPA, were here. Ann Healy has been part of that movement directly. FCDO, on the back of deliverology and other impact, began to grow its evidence investments. All of this culminated in Nobel Prizes, and 3IE's evidence portal now includes over 10,000 impact evaluations. But there are 4 important ways in which the evidence revolution still falls very, very short. And we've looked at these issues in a 2021-22 working group here at CGD. I'll just go through 4 of these points, and I think our panel will take it up later. So first, still too few policies and programs are evaluated. It's generally less than 10% if we look at donor portfolios. It's less if we look at government portfolios. The availability of evidence is unrelated to the areas of largest spending. Journal articles are still the dissemination paradigm. Embedded labs and government initiatives to use evidence in an ongoing way to adjust programs is still relatively uncommon. We're not generating evidence and evaluation in ways that enable real-world action on cost saving or impact enhancement. And it might still pay to be ignorant. So this idea of what are the institutional incentives inside governments and in aid agencies, how can we accept disappointment even if we implement perfectly but we don't achieve our goals? And the real world requires new approaches, data and methods, and appreciation of all kinds of evidence. Cost data, starting with cost data. Only 15 to 25% of evaluations look at costs, and how are we supposed to know if we're doing better if we are not assessing versus our existing spend? But we have to be faster, we have to be more iterative, and we have to be inexpensive. Our working group looked at the growing use of new data sources and innovative methods, but I think we could all agree they're underused and there's more to be done. So we're here to address these shortcomings and reinvigorate the development effectiveness and evidence agenda in development agencies, and I'm handing it over now to Marie Gaarder. Happy birthday, Marie, CEO of 3IE.
Welcome everyone in the room and online to this anniversary event of 3IE. And thank you to CGD and Amanda and her team for agreeing to co-organizing and hosting this event celebrating 3IE's 15th anniversary. It was natural for us to reach out to CGD, given this long-standing, 15 years or more, relationship between our 2 institutions. And most importantly, given our joint mission to improve the use of evidence to inform decision-making in international development. Or, to say it and to put it quite simply, better use of better evidence for a better world. While we have called this an anniversary event, this will not be a celebration of what we have achieved all together with our partners over these 15 years. Rather, it will be an earnest but hopefully productive exchange about what we absolutely need to do next, because the situation calls for urgent action. You might have read, I'm sure you have, over the last year or more, that the pandemic, compounded by the Ukraine war, climate change, they all have adversely affected lives of people globally. We're still learning the extent of these impacts, but several international organizations have sounded the alarm. Here's a few data points to help you contextualize this. So, on hunger, from the World Food Programme, we know that more than 345 million people face high levels of food insecurity. And this is, by the way, more than double the number in 2020. On poverty, according to the UN Human Development Index report, we know that human development has regressed globally. 90% of the countries have fallen behind on life expectancy, education, and economic prosperity. On education, the number of children in low and middle-income countries who are unable to read and understand a simple text by age 10 is now close to 70%, which is up from 57% pre-pandemic. So these are just some examples of recent data that have pretty much one thing in common. They show that the situation for many fellow citizens in this world is critical and has worsened over the last years. And then that's one set of numbers. So let me refer you to another set of numbers. Access to relevant, practical, digestible evidence has improved a lot over these 15 years, as Amanda already alluded to. The body of effectiveness studies increased from just a few hundreds in the early 2000s to over 11,000 impact evaluations and another 1,000 systematic reviews that are now searchable in 3IE's Development Effectiveness portal. And 3IE and similar organizations have developed portals, help desks, and tools to rapidly synthesize and translate existing evidence for implementers and decision makers. So really, the body of evidence that can inform decisions has increased dramatically. Yet, the good and timely use of this evidence continues to be really challenging. And one key challenge identified by the working group report that Amanda talked about, that CGD convened and 3IE also was happy to take part in, is that multilateral and bilateral development institutions often lack institutional incentives, consistent signals, and role modeling from leadership on the importance of learning and evidence use. And to quote the report, professional success is still too often measured by project approval and disbursements, as opposed to learning from, acting on, and sharing of evidence. Evidence use needs to be planned for and woven into the institutional culture. I believe that we can do better and that it is incumbent upon us to do so. And for that, we have to share and learn from each other, others' experiences, and our trials and errors. And with that, it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Ilan Goldfajn, who's president of the Inter-American Development Bank. Mr. Goldfajn was elected IDB president in November 2022 and has already impressed many of, and myself included, by his clear signaling on the need to prioritize development effectiveness. Mr. Goldfajn has a long and distinguished career. He has, among others, previously served as director of the Western Hemisphere Department at the IMF and as governor of the Banco Central do Brasil. In 2017, he was elected Central Banker of the Year by the Banker magazine. The year after, Global Finance magazine named him the best central banker. Mr. Goldfajn also has extensive private sector experience as well as an extensive academic career. So, President Goldfajn, the stage is yours.
So, thank you, Mary, thank you, Amanda, thank you, 3IE and CGD. It's an honor to be here. And to be honest, I think it's very adequate that I'm here for two reasons. One is that I do care deeply about development effectiveness. And we know, I mean, not only from the working group, that change comes from the leadership, from incentives, from models, from giving the right approach from the top. So this is where I want to be. The other hand, it's also true that a lot has been experienced. There's a lot to learn. So we have now a panel that will teach us. I don't plan to come with all the answers. I need to learn from the experience that everybody has come, and it is not a coincidence that a lot of the experience, a lot of the studies came from the IDB. So my goal is that the next step will also be led by the IDB, and I hope that we achieve that. I do believe that we need transformation in development effectiveness. I've been saying that it's almost like a cultural transformation. It doesn't mean that nothing has happened. A lot has improved. As you also mentioned, there's a lot of evidence, and now we know more, and that's the result of past efforts. But I do believe that to change things, it's a holistic approach. It's a cultural change. I'm going to give you one of them, just an example, and then I'm going to go over a lot of the issues. We all, multilateral organizations, institutions, NGOs, we talk about dollars, resources. And it's okay, that's the unit of account. We're not going to get rid of dollars. And I come from central bank, so I'm not going to get rid of dollars. But it's generating a bias because we are measured by the amount of resources we provide. So it will not surprise you that you'll measure your success saying this year the IDB lent 12 billion, next year it's going to be 15 billion, and then it's going to be 18 billion. I just gave an interview, and I didn't ask for that, but that was the information that came. IDB 12 billion, but nobody asked what we have done with the 12 billion. And to change that, it's not just changing a phrase in an interview. It's a cultural change. So that's just one example that we need to do. It's not the IDB, this is everybody. So what is the vision? I'm going to separate in 5 plus 1 summary. 6 areas. First, as I mentioned, we need to target final results. We need to look at the indicators of what are we changing. Number of people with housing, out of poverty, how many people we are connecting, how many people have sanitation, what are we doing with their education. We need to be there and not in the amount of dollars we lend. Second, we need to monitor continuously. And that means learning, adjusting, gaining knowledge from the evidence. And that's, as you mentioned, it's everything I say, it's easier to say than done. But we need to go there. To do that, we need a third part, which is governance for effectiveness. We need to signal from the top where we're going, what are the priorities. We need to establish processes of checks and balances. And then the fourth point is related to that. We need an effectiveness-based meritocracy. We need to give the right incentives linked to if we are effective or not. So you're promoted when you finish a project. How many projects you finish? It's not going to be a surprise to you that officers in the field, and again, it's not IDB alone, are motivated to close deals. They have their envelope, they have their goals, they have the targets for the year, and they are kind of, they want to push for projects to close. But we want them to close effective projects that will have an impact. That's quite a difference. 5, effectiveness does not end here in Washington. Effectiveness does not end even in our offices. Effectiveness is related to who is implementing the project, the client, we call it, but are the government authorities who's running the project. The effectiveness, and this is not a minor point, I'm going to deal with all of these issues. Sometimes you have very good ideas, very effective here, but we lack capacity by whoever is in charge of this project. So we need to have joint IDB client effectiveness. And 6 is basically what I mentioned. We need an effectiveness culture. So we need all of the above together with a change. That's the holistic. So let me start with my first point, which is targeting final results, effectiveness targeting. As I mentioned, money, the amount of dollars, is the widely used measure of development. I have nothing against proxies when the proxies work. And the proxies to work, they need to have a stable relationship between dollars and impact. And then you can use the proxy as a real measure of the impact. The way I see it now is that the relationship has broken. We can have a lot of resources spent in places where small impact you have, and you have places where you have small amount generating a large impact. And this difference is now is, I think, the general and not the exception. And in other areas, when the relationship between your proxy, or you can call it intermediate targets, and your final targets have broken, we have gone directly to the final, as difficult as it could be. And again, I'm coming from central banking, and all the inflation targeting is exactly that. Is getting out of intermediate with money aggregates and whatever, and going directly to your outcome, which was inflation. So we need to do it again here. But we do know that this is a very difficult task. Not only because we need to find indicators, we need to find the measure, we need to find what indicators, what is the aggregation of the indicators, but we need to achieve attribution. I mean, are these indicators related to the project? Are they not? Are they related to the region? Commodity boom. I mean, during the commodity boom period, 2003, 2013, I tend to say that everybody went up. All policies was great. All governments did a wonderful job. There was no distinction. And I think just because the tide went up. So how do we distinguish between what we are proposing and what is the general? So all of these are very, very difficult tasks. And if you ask me, it will be easier to just stay with the current proxy. But unfortunately, that will just be fooling ourselves, because it looks to me that we are not allowed anymore, because this is just not giving us the right approach. We need to do, if we're going to target the impact, we need to have ambitious but realistic goals. We need to focus and be selective, and that's something that has been said, including there was an interesting blog by the CGD talking about how important it is to focus, to have the priorities, because in that regard you can actually target the projects that have more impact and not the ones that may have less impact. So from our point of view, we're going to start with an exercise, actually a mandate by our board to start with an exercise of priority. We're going to start with, in the institutional strategy, this year just saying, what are we going to do? What is first, what is later? I say, if everything is a priority, I've been saying this, if everything is a priority, as usually it is, because you want to aggregate not only the needs of staff, but also the needs of the countries. So everybody wants to be involved, everybody wants to be part, which is noble. But if everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. And for the effectiveness, everything is a priority is damaging. We need to be able to prioritize in a region that needs a lot. So again, easier to say than to do. How are we going to prioritize in regions that need more? But we will need to focus to be more effective. And of course, we will need to use evidence to make the decisions. And I'm fully into looking at how we're going to look at the evidence, how it has been used. The IDB has quite a bit of experience with that. So I'm going to see what exists, how we can improve that. Of course, we'll need digital transformation. We will need to use technology in our favor to look at the evidence. Second point, continuous monitoring. So here, we need to learn and adjust timely based on evidence. So you need to be agile, as I mentioned, with technology, but changes are needed. Nobody's perfect, right? I have one number that says that projects in IDB and other places rarely change. And the IDB is like 90-something%. It starts, it doesn't change. I don't think we are so successful. I mean, in areas and other areas, people if they get 60% right, they're very happy, right? So we need to be able to change courses, to adapt, to learn. So that's very, very important. And in that regard, failures are as important or even more than successes to effectiveness. And you can imagine, and then I go back to culture, it is not easy to drive a culture of accepting failures, right? We tend, including myself, we tend to say, well, this is my success. This is what we have done. This is where we've done good. But we need to learn. And the failures are as important. So how do you do it? First, you try to bring the failures and freedom and give the incentives. So you bring changes, also the failures, but also have a transparent and open environment, transparency, which is one of the recommendations that I get. You need to somehow have the board, senior management, able to look at them in a very clear way. Finally, continuous monitoring means that you don't finish when the project is launched. You don't even finish when the project terminates, because a lot of the impact of whatever you do may have medium-term and long-term impact. And that's actually what we want, right? We want to have a more permanent impact, change institutions, change the way knowledge is transferred. So why are we going to evaluate just 3, 5 years, even 7 years when it finishes? So there's a long term in our institutions, but we need even longer term. Again, harder, easier to say, harder to do. Governance. We need checks and balances, as you all know, from basic governance. And I'm not telling you any secret. But if we allow the project to be checked continuously by whoever launched the project, and he's the sole evaluator over time, there are, of course, some conflict of interest. Have I done something wrong? Should I show that something didn't go well? So we're going to give them the freedom, we're going to give them incentives, but we need somebody else to look at it at the same time. And that is not exactly the same one that we're going to evaluate, like the Independence Office 10 years later. So we need 3 lines of defense. Again, it's not a major secret. The person in front, launching the project, looking at the project, somebody from the organization checking that, and finally, at the end, evaluation. Not a big magic, but basic checks and balances, and we need to put them there. And of course, we need to have the strategy, project evaluation with digitalization. So everything is important. Number 4, effectiveness-based meritocracy. If we continue to promote and give performance based on how much was the envelope, how much you lent, how much you're actually generating in projects, which used to be maybe a good proxy, we will not get the effectiveness that we want. We will not get the impact. Somehow we need to link the promotions and the performance and how much we pay and the KPIs to some measure of impact, of effectiveness. Is it easy? No. I'm already getting into these discussions with the HR and talking about KPIs, indicators, and the indicators come. They are usual indicators, very nice. Where is effectiveness? How do we measure? How do we do it? Again, it's easy to not do it, to continue, but we don't have an option if we really want an impact. And again, I don't need to tell this audience about why is important effectiveness, why is important impact. We need to do so much. climate, social, infrastructure in this region, that if we don't care about impact, we will not do our job. So again, difficult to do, but we have no option than to get into that and try to if we get 50% or 60% of what I'm putting here, I will be very happy. Of course, I want to get 100%. Client effectiveness. Ownership of the project is essential. So we need to be aligned with the country, and the country needs to be aligned with our impact indicators. Because if the client or if the country wants something else from the loan than what we believe are the impact, it's not going to work, right? We provide the loan, we push for the indicators, they push for something else. At the end of the day, we are misaligned. So we need to be aligned of where we want to go. And here is very important, because usually institutions are very willing to help the countries. There's so much need to help the governments. And the governments have their priorities. And they can come to the institution or to the MDBs and they say, this is what I want to do, this is my plan. We are very happy to help the governments. We are very happy to be the Banco Amigo, IDB. But I want to be a Banco Amigo with priorities, a Banco Amigo that have impact. And the only way to do it is to help in the places where we agree that those are the priorities. Second, sometimes we do agree and we are aligned, but there's no capacity. So we can fool ourselves that we agree, these are the priorities, this is the project, we approve the project, nothing happens. Why? Because we need execution capacity, we need capacity building, we need to use the technical assistance to actually make the project be effective. And I can tell you that lately, I have been getting a lot of requests for capacity building. Very clear, very transparent. To say, well, we need more of you in the capacity building, which is music to our ears because we believe IDB is a knowledge bank, is a bank based on evidence, and that transferring the knowledge is as or more important than the financing. So capacity building is important. IDB client joint effectiveness is essential. Finally, everything means that we need to change the culture. So effectiveness culture is important. So I said about ultimate goal targeting, effectiveness meritocracy, monitor with checks and balances continuously and even after the project ends. Client effectiveness, all of this needs a cultural change. And cultural change, as you know, are not easy, but they start here. We start with this conversation, we start with us hearing you, and we start with all your experience and all what you have brought in the last years and decades. Thank you very much.
Introductions to this distinguished panel. So they are all, in my view, heroes. I want to say up front. They have been working within organizations, have been or are working within organizations or governments or both to improve development effectiveness in various ways. And so I'm sure as well that you all have the scars to prove it. Or the lessons to draw out. And as you also heard from President Ilan, he would very much love to hear as well from those experiences, also the tough ones. all of you have long, impressive bios that I will not read up to all of you. You can find them online, but I will make just a brief introduction. So Shekhar Bono is a former Director General, Development Monitoring and Evaluation Office at Niti Aayog in India. Niti Aayog, for those of you who are not familiar, it serves as the apex public policy think tank of the government of India and the nodal agency tasked with catalyzing economic development. And he's also a 3IE board member. Anne Healy is a senior advisor to the chief economist at the US Agency for International Development, or USAID. Arianna Legovini, director of the Development Impact Evaluation, or DIME, at the World Bank. Santiago Levy, non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and also a 3IE board member, and has had many other hats in the past. I think most of you are familiar with him. Håvard Moklein Nygaard is Director of Knowledge at the Norwegian Agency for Development Cooperation, or NORAD. And last but not least, Nathaniel Bevan is Deputy Director of Research in the Research and Evidence Directorate of FCDO. So welcome, and excited therefore to hear from you on a number of issues. So we're going to have quite little time, so there'll sort of be a rapid fire kind of responses. The first question that I had asked the panel to prepare for is to make a brief presentation each from on a specific experience and or story of success in institutionalizing evidence use from your current or prior roles. As you've heard, various of us have already mentioned, by institutionalizing, we sort of refer to putting in place institutional measures like processes, systems, incentives, requirements, etc., that work to reinforce the consistent use of evidence in decision-making processes, be it organizations or in government. So 3 minutes each, and I'll be quite strict about it to ensure we get through the scars part afterwards. So over to you, Shekhar.
Thanks, Marie. So where evaluation is not mandated by constitution or legislation, I think administrative mandates are very, very critical. I think the mandate that was issued by Government of India played a very important role to generate the need for evaluations and use of evidence. So what Government of India did is saying that no scheme from one finance cycle to another finance cycle can go without third-party independent evaluation. And this was strictly, we have a finance commission cycle, so every project comes for review. The second is the use. Finance Ministry took this very seriously. So they were looking for evaluations when the projects came for renewal. And we in Niti Aayog were supposed to generate, do these evaluations. Certainly, one innovation is the policymakers are very busy. How do you communicate these complex findings? So I think the innovation I think we did was, of course, have crisp executive summaries, but also use traffic lights. And we used OECD framework and so forth. So that then I think there are two other, and then I will stop. Simultaneously, Government of India went in for output outcome monitoring framework, where any scheme at the project approval stage, they have to come up with clearly measurable outputs and outcomes. And these are reported to the Parliament along with the budget every year. Along with the budget document, there's an output outcome monitoring framework. So this has established ex ante accountability to deliver results, and has made evaluations that much easy because you already have clear indicators. Then coming back to monitoring, looking at the digitization and the technology capabilities, Indian government went in for a framework called Data Governance Quality Index and compared, used this framework to assess each ministry to figure out how they were using digital technologies to improve the quality of monitoring in all dimensions: collection, use, security, analyticals, and so forth. So I think these 4 or 5 were really good enablers in demand as well as use of evidence.
Excellent, thank you. Anne?
Sure, yeah, I'll share an example from a couple of my roles, USAID as well as JPAL. Several years ago, there was an innovative partnership that JPAL and others were involved in, helping the Ministry of General Education in Zambia adopt a highly cost-effective evidence-based intervention, targeted instruction, also known as teaching at the right level, and scale it via the government in Zambia. There was quite a lot of momentum based on some early work, such that the government actually committed to adopting the intervention at scale and was in the early stages of it. And the USAID Zambia mission came in to actually support that initial phase of scale. And that was a really critical set of resources to enable what ultimately has become a nationwide scale up. But it was a fairly non-traditional grant for a USAID mission to make. It was non-traditional in the sense that it involved, a non-traditional set of implementing partners for USAID. It was a combination of evidence and research-focused organizations like JPAL Africa at the University of Cape Town. It involved UNICEF. It involved an Indian NGO, Pratham, that really pioneered developing this approach and was helping to adapt it and scale it with partners in Africa. So it was a non-traditional type of grant for a USAID mission to consider making in the education space. And it really did benefit from there being sort of a team with a very evidence-focused mandate that could be a partner to the mission to help them figure out how to actually make that non-traditional grant. And it also benefited from sort of the flexibility that the program I was working with at the time, the Development Innovation Ventures program in Washington, the flexibility that program had in addition to the evidence-focused mandate. And so, I think that's speaks to what typical teams in these large bilateral and multilateral agencies often need is a partner that has evidence as a mandate and some of the flexibility to think through how within a large institutional context can you potentially do things differently in making an award.
Great, thank you. Ariana?
Thank you, Marie. Well, so we have come a long way, as you well know. It's wonderful to have so many friends around the table. We started very small, almost 20 years ago at the World Bank, trying to push a systematic change in the way evidence is generated and used. As I said, we've come a long way. We started with a small initiative, became a unit, and then a department. Now we have a large department working across all sectors. The big game changer was actually the UK, who provided a large funding back in 2013 that allowed us to develop a program in all sector areas and demonstrate that trials are not only for education and health, but can be applied everywhere. And so I want to talk just briefly about our iConnect program, which is our program of experimental impact evaluation in transport, which we launched in 2015. So obviously people made fun of us for, are you going to randomize the placement of highways? And no, we have not placed highways randomly, but we have experimented widely with large infrastructures to understand affordability issues, displacements of poor populations because of rising real estate costs and rentals. We have experimented with workers, young people in developing countries working on the construction of big infrastructure to understand employability and skills and how construction can be a push for job creation in the countries, transforming kind of the economic concept of what this infrastructure can do. Back then, 3IE had produced this evidence map that showed that even though transport was 20%, more than 20% of development finance, it only represented less than 1%, 0.9% of impact evaluations. So we took that challenge and pushed it forward. And this was really amazing. And I want to say that this is an area which was super challenging. Why? Because, of course, of the scale and difficulty in looking at things at national or even city scale, urban mobility, complex systems that require a lot of data. So here we invested a lot in digital. And to invest in digital, we worked with government agencies. For example, in Nairobi, we worked with 5 different ministries and agencies building integrated data systems that combine administrative data with survey data with innovative technology data from the private sector, such as Waze and Uber and weather. We use mobile. We use machine learning to extract information from Twitter. We applied, we used mapping from satellite and so forth and so on, mobile technologies to create the first integrated high-frequency data systems that is now being operated by the Kenya Urban Road Authority and the National Road Safety Authority. And I'm going to close by just saying, on the prioritization that Ilan put on our table, 1% of the road network represents 50% of the deaths and injuries. Now giving Kura a map of how to prioritize investments where they matter most. And so we are now working in that environment to look at e-mobility and the introduction of bus rapid transit with a new authority called Namata, which will be supporting under digital development.
Excellent. Thank you. Santiago.
So thank you for inviting me, and congratulations on the 15 years. So as Amanda mentioned, I was very involved in the development of a program in Mexico that was the pioneer in conditional cash transfers. I was also involved in setting up a national commission for evaluation of all programs. And so I want to talk about a semi-success, but also about a semi-failure. And that semi-failure has to do with what I think is an analytical failure of the impact evaluation literature. And I want to sort of pose this challenge because I think that looking forward, we really need to tackle this. We made great headways in evaluating individual programs. So we had Progresa, and Amanda talked a little bit about the results. There must be more than 100 papers published on the impacts of Progresa on various dimensions of human capital. In parallel, we also put in other health programs, other daycare programs, other pension programs, other labor training programs. We never evaluated how the different pieces of the puzzle work together. We looked at individual trees. We never saw the forest. The trees, some of them were very pretty. The forest was ugly. What resulted from the development of individual, well-evaluated programs was a system of incoherent incentives that resulted in a semi-failure. 20 years after Progresa, the human capital indicators all improved. Years of schooling, morbidity, you name it. The real wages of poor workers are the same today as they were 20 years ago, despite having more education and more human capital than their elders. The fundamental reason is that the set of programs that we put together, all together, generated very perverse incentives, not only in terms of labor participation, but in terms of the formal, informal composition of the economy, the size of firms, and the growth of firms. So this is a telling story about we really need to push our game further. We've learned a lot in the last 15 years, perhaps more, about impact evaluation of individual programs. We need to develop methodologies to look at the whole. We have to think about the general equilibrium of the system. And looking at individual programs by themselves is part of the solution, but if you take the example from Mexico, and I could talk about this in Colombia, and I could talk about this in Peru and other countries in Latin America, the story is not very different. When you look at the general equilibrium of individual programs, the impacts are very different, and they're large, and not the ones that you desired. So there's a big change looking ahead and a big challenge looking ahead. And in the next 15 years of 3AE, I hope these are the sort of things that we tackle. Thank you.
Thank you, Santiago. Excellent. Håvard.
Yeah, thank you, and happy birthday. I think I want to I want to bring up four points that I think have been important for institutionalization at NORAD and the Norwegian system quite recently. So basically starting from the top down in the organization. So first, this year, for the first time, so the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and their political leadership put in the state budget, which is important because it's in the state budget that we list priorities for the government. So now it says in the Norwegian state budget that Norwegian development assistance should be knowledge-based. Obviously, it was supposed to be that before as well, but now it says so in the state budget, which is nice. And it says that we should, or we can, prioritize spending on impact evaluation, real-term evaluations across the programs of the aid budget. That's important because it gives the political signal and the signal from the ministry that this is something that they want to see done throughout Norwegian development aid. So that's the first. Second, then to follow up this, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs put in their the so-called grant letter, which is the annual letter from the ministry to NORAD that sets out its priorities for us. It says that NORAD should prioritize development effectiveness, which is also something new, and it has quite big implications for how we think around the things we fund and the things we don't fund. So those two things, to a large extent, takes part of the big overarching political and Ministry of Foreign Affairs signals. Then NORAD now has a new strategy that puts knowledge center stage, and I think you really can't underplay the importance of this. NORAD has a director general that really puts knowledge center stage. So Bo Vegard Solhjell was here on this stage just a few weeks ago during the spring meetings, and he got everyone to chant his slogan, this "Fakta har makta," which means facts inform policy or whatever. Beautiful in English. In Norwegian, doesn't really translate. And obviously, "Fakta har makta" is a gimmick. Obviously, it's oversimplifying, but it's an extremely useful gimmick, right? Because it starts conversations, it creates discussions, it creates tensions, but it puts it on the agenda all the time. And and that gimmick and that slogan, in combination with a lot of other strategic stuff, meant that we had the signals from the top leadership that were absolutely essential. So that takes part of the top-down part, but you also need the bottom-up part, right? So now we are in the process of reorganizing basically everything we do at NORAD in more coherent portfolios. It's mandated that as part of every portfolio, so every portfolio needs to have a theory of change, they need to have a knowledge map, and they need to have a knowledge plan. And that basically means that now everyone in the organization are working with knowledge in their thematic areas and thinking about how to use evaluation strategically to fill the knowledge gaps, to monitor, to make sure that we are not just monitoring results, but also are able to say something useful about the results we achieve, what we achieve, or what we don't achieve, and how we can use that to change course if and when necessary. And that has, that means that this is now much further up on the list of priorities of the mid-level managers and then also the caseworkers, and that's key. And lastly, my fourth point is, so NORAD is not an implementing agency. We don't implement a single project ourselves. That means we can be, the most fantastic knowledge-based organization in the world, but if our partners aren't also knowledge-based, working with evaluation, then we're not really doing anything. So the last piece of the puzzle for us right now is to ensure that in our calls for proposals, for instance, that there are requirements for knowledge use, that we say concretely that we will, when we evaluate their applications, their knowledge use will be part of the evaluation criteria. And also that we want them to prioritize high quality evaluation, including impact evaluation as part of their grant proposals, which is key, right? Because it is, it's always going to be hard for an NGO to make the prioritization between delivery and spending on knowledge, because it's always going to be looked on as being a friction between the two, and we can talk more about that. And I think that's a false equivalence. But the fact that we are now saying to them, yes, we want you to prioritize evaluation is critical.
Excellent. Nathaniel, and you said you maybe actually want to do the success and also the challenge in one go. So if you invite you to do that, because then I'll do a U-turn and I go back down again.
Right. Okay, thank you. So hi, I'm Nathaniel. As Marie said, I am now the Deputy Director in the Research Department at FCDO. And I've worked for about 20 years on this kind of question about how do you get evidence-informed policy making into practice. But my last job before this was 4 years in Nepal, where I made a kind of deliberate decision to do a much more kind of generalist delivery leadership role. So I thought I'd talk about that a bit, about my experience of being on the dark side of international development. So what I thought was important there in Nepal was, actually, as you were saying, Santiago, how can we go from a kind of, actually, in what was then DFID, quite a lot of program evaluations, thinking much more about a kind of portfolio approach to understanding the collective impact of what we are, what the UK is working with in Nepal on international development. So I'll just draw out three quick kind of lessons from that. The first was that the sort of political economy of decision making was really important, much more than the kind of evidence use and uptake was really understanding how decisions get made about UK funding in Nepal. And that happens at lots of different levels. So there's a kind of ministerial level, there's a kind of leadership in Nepal, but then there's also the sort of day-to-day of how program managers decide where stuff gets implemented, how data is collected on those. And I think that for me was quite insightful in terms of often the incentives didn't really lie with better programming. I mean, obviously, better programming is what, and the kind of making sure that we were delivering with Nepal the priorities they wanted, right? Fine. But actually, what are the other incentives that people have? And certainly as someone in a leadership position, what gets recognized, what gets praised, to some extent also kind of how decisions are made about promotion, right? And kind of just the sort of nuts and bolts of jobs. But also then how are people, how collectively did we as a group of people working in Nepal want to be seen both by our peers across the rest of FCDO and by the Nepalese and by other donors? And already DFID had a sort of a reputation as someone who was investing in evidence, but in Nepal there'd been a long history of it. And it was part of how kind of people saw themselves. And so when the merger came, DFID and the Foreign Office being merged together, there was this real opportunity actually to create a feeling, a culture that the USP for the FCDO in Nepal was around using evidence and using evidence to understand the impact of the portfolio. So that's one thing I think. The second is kind of less prosaic, I suppose, and just about systems and processes. And kind of people have talked about this already, but just like physically, who sits on a board, and how do those decisions get made, and how does evidence go into that? And so a lot of that was around, for example, bringing in external academic voices to some of those conversations where perhaps the evidence maybe isn't quite ready, but at least we can get some challenge. And then the third and final area is around resourcing. And I think it was, it's maybe slightly easier being in a position where you both love evidence and you have some control over the money, but to pay people to actually do research and evidence uptake is just really helps, right? And I think it's a bit like, NORAD. I mean, I think it just feels like, NORAD really visible and like focused on evidence now in a way, right? And just doing stuff. And there is something about having a sufficient number of people who are working on this stuff, who are busy and who care about it to make it successful. All right, I'll stop there, and then shall I talk about how it all went completely wrong? Everybody go, no. Do you want me to talk about challenges?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I hadn't actually prepared this bit. I have to look at my notes now. So I came up with 3 challenges. So the first thing was that this was the kind of plan that I had, and it sort of was going quite well. And then there was Odekut's COVID, and there's been some quite big political changes in Nepal as well. And actually, none of what we really did was able to withstand that, to be honest. And so it set us back 9 months. And what we had to do was to think about the systems and processes that would support evidence in a crisis. And I'll just give one example of what I found personally really difficult and challenging was around evidence on school opening. So at the time, when COVID hit, it wasn't really clear what the evidence was or what really the right options were. But what took us maybe kind of 9 months to get that back on track and being able to bring evidence to the Nepal government about the damaging impact of school closures on children, just didn't work and just didn't land. Schools stayed closed until February last year, and have had a hugely negative impact on children. And so I kind of reflected on that, and I think it's this kind of point about the sort of individual evidence use versus a sort of portfolio approach. Success is about being really clear that whenever we're making a decision, we're bringing the best available evidence into that. And sometimes there are just a set of political, cultural things that just trump that. And as long as that decision is transparent, then I think that's fine. Well, yeah. doesn't feel fine at the time, right? It really doesn't. But yeah. And then so the last thing I then wanted to say is just I think it's really about kind of persistence and incremental change. I think a lot of this, if you look kind of where we've come from and wherever, I'm looking at Berta, the first systematic review ever in the world in 1970 or something. We've come a long way. We've come a long way from there, but it does take time.
Excellent. So, Håvard, is it true? Do you have the amount of people that have you reached
I'm not sure they have got, but they're just really busy, aren't they? It's like you just always
tipping point.
Always busy. I don't know. We never have enough people, but we have people with lots of scars. I think. Well, first of all, I think Natalia's point of doing all the it's finding all these opportunities that open up and just grabbing them, and then slowly but surely you move. Is usually a fairly good way to work with these things. But I think there are, if I'm going to point to 2 or 3 main challenges that are still giving me scars, then, first, and Ilan mentioned this as well, the number one indicator still in our system is how much money did you pay out last year. That is by far the most important. I am forever naively flabbergasted by the fact that it's worse to pay out less than 49.6 billion a year than it is to spend 49.6 billion on something that has low development effectiveness. That's not going to change. That's a hardwired into the system, into the public system, and that is always creating perverse incentives. Means that the closer you're getting to the end deadline, the less important evidence becomes, and it means that you really have, you really have to think about how you structure the processes. Yeah. Nobody is going to think rigorously about evidence and evaluations in November. Then it's just about getting the rest of the money out the door. But November last year is when you need to start getting people to think about, right? November
25 or whatever. And that working with that time horizon, which I think is also something that, because I come from the academic world, I think that's something academics don't really understand or appreciate, how important that time constraint is. And that's also creates difficulties of collaboration. So I think that's the main thing.
Sorry, we have to.
Oh, sorry. I can show you my other scars.
I was shown that. I'll just say I wear one scar as well. I also worked in NORAD for a little while. I just mentioned one thing: procurement systems. But anyway, Santiago, and you get 1 minute each, or you can pass it on to the next person. So just briefly, your one biggest sort of.
Well, I have many, but I'll tell you one that is relevant for the conversation, which is at the beginning of the term of the current president of Mexico, I met with him, and I sort of showed him the evidence on Progresa, and I said, look, this is what's happening. And he decided to suspend the program and to actually basically discontinue. So the reason I bring it up, aside from the fact that it saddens me tremendously, is we have to understand a lot more the sociology of knowledge transmission. Yeah. People have priors. People have beliefs. And evidence, in the way we understand evidence, is not always evidence for other people. It's partly political economy, but it's partly sociology. The thought that we are here, we produce evidence, we find out what works, and then we go to people and government officials and we tell them, this is what works, go ahead and implement it. It's kind of a bit naive. And we need to devote some time. I mentioned in my previous intervention, we need to give time to the analytics of general equilibrium. We also have to give time to the sociology of knowledge absorption. And those two things, I think, is where we really need to put the research effort in the years ahead.
Right.
To get impact evaluation going.
Brilliant. Thank you. Very brief, Ariana.
Yes, I'm going to pick one out of the many challenges, and I'll say value for money. So this is quite interesting, I think, because we have done the impact evaluation of impact evaluation, causal evaluation of the value of knowledge on development impact, and determined at large scale through 165 products that 1% of development finance in iterative, adaptive evidence actually increases development impact by at least 50%, mostly doubles the development impact of our operations. So value for money is not well understood, and thus the amount of money that goes into impact evaluation research is actually very, very tiny. So we are now in the process. We are done with piloting. We have piloted for 20 years. We are happy and ready to move to the next stage, which is systematic adoption of what we call trial and adopt, early evaluation to test different ideas, avoid failure, secure success. We are not here to tell you you're not good enough. We are here to test different ideas, give up ideology, and really go through the empirical evidence to lead the way forward. We find that by doing that, over time, we can increase impact by large margins. Yet, the allocations of funding is still to be seen. I think we need to really push very hard for this 1% of the development finance to be put in the empirical research early on in program implementation to lead the way and change the way we implement our programs very radically.
Great. Anne?
Yeah, so a challenge I think is, I mean, this is not a new insight, obviously, but it's not easy or straightforward to, take a global evidence base and know whether or not it applies in your context as a practitioner or policymaker, or if it does, how to apply it to kind of your real world lived context. That's not straightforward. And that's certainly not something in large institutions. USAID has many thousands of employees. It's not something that you should necessarily expect, every single colleague to be expert in doing. And so I think a real challenge for large organizations, whether you're a multilateral, bilateral government, is how do you have a sufficient capacity of sort of evidence translators who can sit between and bridge the space between the evidence producers and the evidence users to make sense of that adaptation and application process. And that is a unique skill set. It is not in large enough supply in this overall ecosystem, and I think a challenge for those of us at large institutions that predominantly are funders is to think about what more we can do to, catalyze more of that skill set existing in the ecosystem.
Brilliant. Shekhar.
Yeah, I think capacities, are key challenges. I think the capacity within the government and also across the larger ecosystem. So within the government, we thought, okay, how do we address capacity issues? So we went in for lateral hiring of talent. Then we realized the lateral talent in academia, think tanks, consulting was also quite constrained. The other scale where we can pivot in capacity is by outsourcing. Instead of doing it everything yourself, you outsource it. So, but there you need really good consulting services. You need that procurement capabilities, ability to write terms of reference. So I think it is not directly related to impact evaluation, but I think procurement and building those capabilities in the external ecosystem, I think are also extremely critical.
Brilliant, thank you. Let's go straight over to the Q&A phase. Amanda, take it away.
Thanks, everyone. So we'll go to the audience now to collect a couple of questions. Someone's coming around. So in the back, Ishani, do we have our? Yeah, okay. Starting in the back. Then we have over here and here.
Thank you. Thanks for these fantastic set of comments. I'm Ishani Kanpal. I'm a senior fellow here at CGD. Before this, I was a researcher in the World Bank's research department for a long time. I was really struck by the calls for the use of the best evidence. And then tying that back to the comments about the sociology of knowledge absorption and these translators, I'd love to hear more about who decides within an IFI or an MDB or a donor what the best evidence is. Clearly, sometimes there'll be important deviations from the academic judgment of what the best evidence is when it comes to implementation. So what is that cadre? And then how do we make that cadre big enough and sort of solid enough that when the best evidence goes against what the implementers want to hear, that the best evidence is still heard?
That is a difficult question. Okay. I had someone here in the middle.
Thanks so much. I'm Amy Bernath. I lead the education practice at IREX. We're an international NGO and what would be termed in this conversation an implementing partner. I think we got off easy, so thanks for that. But I want to pick up on Håvard's fourth point about partners and maybe push that a little bit further, because I think the incentives are off for us too. So I wanted to ask broadly what you think the role of outcomes-based financing, results-based financing, and pay-for-results style incentives is in pushing this agenda forward. Thanks.
Wow. CGD, we love that topic. Okay, back here. Here, maybe I'll just pass it directly.
Hi, thank you very much to the panel. I'm Jochen Kluwer. I'm head of evaluation at KfW, German Development Bank. I'm also a professor of economics. I have an academic background. And I want to touch on this issue of the evidence translators, because I think this is really key now that we have this wealth of evidence, for instance, in 3IE's portals, a tremendous achievement. So when I started in my position as head of evaluation almost 4 years ago, it was really this: how can we make evaluations usable? And it relates also a lot about what kind of evidence we're talking about. So what we did in the department, we have more than 1,000 evaluations from the past 2 decades, and we programmed it into a database, programmed an app, so it's easily accessible. Within 10 seconds, you have all the knowledge, but it's the internal evidence. No? So our operational staff, they know this is what we've been producing in the organization. So for that, you don't really need the translators, because the people, they know what we do, what the work that the bank does. So they can immediately use that. But for the other evidence, this is really crucial. How can we translate that? So, well, I want to emphasize that, from an institutional perspective, this is really key, I think, for an evaluation department, this task. And if the panel has any further ideas of how we can set up these evidence translators and make evaluation evidence more useful and usable, easy usable, that would be very welcome, because I think this is really the key task. Thank you very much.
Okay, so back to you. You're in an IFI. Obviously, we have some people here who were right at the top. Maybe I'll ask Santiago, since Ilan left. Think back to your time when you were at the IDB, and there was some bad news evidence on a program or a portfolio of what's going on. How to communicate that to governments that are also clients and elicit, what is a good experience, what is a bad experience?
I don't like the expression "the best evidence." I probably would use the expression "the relevant evidence," and sort of if you're serious with a policymaker, you are telling him that there's no perfect answer, and that there's no silver bullet, and that there are range of options, and that each one has a pros and cons, and then you don't really need a translator. You need more an adapter. Because from the evidence portal of 3IE to the reality of Paraguay or Honduras or Peru, there's a long distance. And there's a process of adapting that evidence into the local conditions. Now, to come to Amanda's question, sometimes out of the relevant stuff that you put on the table, he's not interested. The policymaker already has something in advance that he wants to make, and he just called on the IDB to validate. And then if the project manager at the IDB is an honest guy, he says, look, call somebody else. Right? Get funding from the Chinese or somebody else. If he, as Ilan was saying when he was saying here, he says, look, I really need to move my projects because I need a promotion, blah, 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 then somehow, there's a mash and things get done. There's not a good mechanism for rejection. There's not a good mechanism for rejection. But prior to rejection, the process of adaptation of knowledge and the process of presenting the relevance for the particular context, I think is really not well done. I don't think it's enough to just quote from this article or from that article that this, this worked in Tunisia or this worked in Senegal, and you should do this tomorrow. I think the adaptation process, it needs to be much richer. And then at the end of the day, it might still be that the guy or the minister, the woman, whatever, already had their mind, and you're not going to change their mind. That happens, and at that point, you should say, no game.
Stuff happens. You can write a paper about it later instead.
Yeah.
We talked, someone was asking about sort of how do I access or make evaluations potable or more accessible or usable, and maybe I'll start with you, Nathaniel, and then go to Anne and Sekar. What FCDO really formerly DFID, funded so much, so many studies, so many assessments. What did you try to do during the first period, and what will you hope to do later to make that more potable for policymakers?
Thanks. Yeah. So my view on this is that actually translation of the evidence is the easier bit. I appreciate it's still not easy, but I think we've come a long way, and I think all of the the stuff that 3IE have done. There are also people in the UK like the Education Endowment Foundation who are starting to look internationally at how you synthesize that sort of evidence really well. I think AI will just transform all of this so that all studies will be searchable and systematically reviewed and available instantly. Now, maybe I'll be wrong about that, but I just think that over time it will that problem will be solved. But I think maybe what this translation problem is not about that evidence being in a nice, neat format. It's this kind of Santiago's point about actually that still isn't enough. So one of the things so I talked about the Nepal example, and is actually the way we found was actually paying someone to do that, to work with our teams. So it was an externally commissioned resource. It was a portfolio monitoring, evaluation and learning unit that had time to work with our staff and to understand they weren't just drawing the evidence in, but they were helping them to apply it. Now, I would love to have had the resources to do that internally, because actually there are people with the skills who can do that. It's just we haven't quite found a way organisationally of doing that yet without buying in. Can I say one thing about implementing? Because I thought Amy's question.
Yeah.
So I think this one also, when I talk about, I think it's not just the resources internally, but the resources within implementing partners. And I think there's a big thing for donors to really think carefully about the structure of programs and how we are funding the collection and the uptake of evidence. And we found that during COVID, where we had a strategy about what we were going to do. You know, I was chairing a delivery board. The data we got was really poor from implementing partners. We felt like it looked like we were working in completely the wrong areas compared to our strategy, and we were helping almost no women. And that was completely unacceptable, but actually what it was is we hadn't really invested with our implementing partners in sufficient resources to collect that data. It's your kind of point, Howard, about that tension between the way in which the money is divided between delivery and measurement. And so we fixed that, and actually it wasn't that we were working in the wrong places and weren't helping any women, but just we weren't collecting the right data. And I think that's, and that process of just sitting down in a meeting and thinking, have we got this completely wrong, or is just that data poor, really fixed a lot of the kind of evidence problems.
Yeah, maybe I'll go to Anne and Ariane. Well, anyone who wants to come in. Howard wants to come. Yeah, go ahead.
Me first or Anne?
Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. No, just
because you're doing something interesting in terms of making findings more easily accessible. Although I love the idea of an AI systematic review, but we should look at their methods, obviously.
Yeah, well, I'll just build on Nathaniel's point. I think this point about needing to actually make it someone's job to play the evidence translation or adaptation, in Santiago's words, to play that role in institutions, and that is, you know, something as at USAID, as we think about, as we're in the process of building the new office of the chief economist, thinking about how do we actually have a cadre of people that can provide that evidence translation, you know, thought partnership and support to the core of USAID, which are missions and other Washington operating units. But how can we kind of develop that as a team and embed that capacity to work alongside our colleagues who are leading, you know, the agency's programming?
And Sekar, anything you want to mention about Niti?
Yeah, I think the impact world is in one place and the governments are at a different plane. It's a 5-year electoral cycle, a huge amount of stress and pressure to deliver. So, and also the impact evaluation world is also a little bit biased in that sense that it is driven by academics for publications, and so let's accept it. Whereas the development world is a lot more complex. It is multidisciplinary. There are many parts of it we have to live with ambiguity, and maybe there are lots of unknown. So this is precisely what happens in the government. They have to deal with all the problems. So they can't be very selective about what problems they have to deal with. So they take this evidence. The channels they come through thought pieces in newspapers. That is largely what majority of the bureaucrats read. Even for a PhD, reading econometric journal is quite tough. Halfway through, you lose them. So through thought pieces it comes, then it goes through the churning process of politics, local intuitive understanding, localization. We can trivialize it by saying that it's all intuitive, but you know, we need to give its due. So it happens. So how can we accelerate this process? You know, I think there's huge amount of evidence there, but unfortunately, it's not getting into the policy discourse. So one way we try to do that is by insisting that on any evaluation, the contractor has to do thorough literature review and bring the state of knowledge, consolidate and put it as a separate chapter. It's the literature review part of a PhD program. Okay, so I think it really worked. So we put 1/3 of the emphasis on literature review. and put it. And we use these various levels of review process. We have inception, midterm, final review, where all stakeholders would come, where all this literature was also presented. So that way we were hoping that this knowledge outside, which is not getting in, hopefully we will get inside. So that, so that means maybe some policy briefs once a while, and also going to the government and building that credibility. I think that's very critical. Once you build that credibility and the bridge, then they will listen. But that means you have to commit to long term. You need to understand them, and then build your case around their constraints.
I mean, it's sort of about making evidence good politics, right? And that's all great if you have good news. It's harder if you have that bad news to share. But Gaarder, you wanted to say something, and then Ariana?
Yeah, I guess I want to connect Ariana's point on value for money and some of Nathaniel. So you said we were letting our implementing partners a little bit easy off the hook here, and maybe and we're now trying to have a few somewhat more what should we say, uncomfortably complicated conversation with some of our partners, but. I also think it's absolutely true that we, so Norway, and I think most of us here, are, we're really, really squeezing our partners when it comes to, nothing is worse in aid, you sometimes get the sense, than administrative costs. You have to, by all means, you have to reduce administrative costs to the barest minimum, which I think is stupid. Right, and it's led us down a very, very unnecessary and unproductive path. So Ariana sometimes says that we shouldn't look at evaluation as a tax on the project. Now in Norway, tax isn't a bad word in any way.
But it is here. So
it is, yeah. but the point stands, right? So having people within our partners that actually know how to use knowledge, that know evidence, giving them time and scope to do rigorous evaluation, all of that is going to increase admin cost. But I'm also absolutely convinced that it's going to increase development effectiveness. And that's back to this value for money thing. And I think that investment really is worth making. But then we have to get out of this idea that anything beyond 5, 6, 7% admin costs somehow is a project failure.
And I think that's why we try to frame it in that working group as really a development intervention in and of itself. Ariana, on any of these topics, and then I'm going to ask both of you, you've both signaled the financing that's available for these activities is not what it could be. You've talked about it being an investment. What would we say to our beloved funders that sit here with us?
So first I want to say that countries are a wonderful place where evidence can be adopted. Local evidence through work, every country has multiple working groups that include all the stakeholders in transport, health, education, and so forth and so on. These are the places where sharing the evidence and agreeing as a community what we want to do with the evidence in each country is powerful. Second, sector programs. Here, leadership is fundamental. I know every single name of every single person, certainly in the World Bank and beyond, that have been critical in changing and transforming their own programs, starting from Jipang Tang in the World Bank, going on a long list of people in operations that were open to putting up their program for contestability and eager to learn how to do better, not because of showing failure, not at all, but to understand how to do better over time. We should not be judging people for the effectiveness now. We should be judging them for how much action they're taking from now to next year and the year after. I want to say that we're also working on the AI of extracting causal evidence. 10,000 papers are being submitted every year to the top 12 journals, only in economics. Even if you take 5 minutes per abstract, it will still take you about 3/4 of your time every year to keep up with the evidence, and the evidence comes from every sector. It is not specific to education. It's not specific to health. So we are trying to figure out, and we're working with some foundational work that 3IE did on systematizing and kind of taking it, hopefully, to the next level, and happy to collaborate on that moving forward. On the financing, funding is tight. We have so many challenges, and people say, oh, but this is one more thing, but it is not one more thing. This is not a cherry on the cake. This is actually part of the ingredient of doing development finance differently so that we can expect, aspire, and motivate more action. So yes, we need to take a little bit of a chunk of what goes into investments, but then to make those investments so much better. What does it mean to take 1%, $1 million from a $100 million loan, and double the impact of that loan? It means that that 1% comes back 10 times over in results. So it is not a tax, it is an investment. If we don't treat it as an investment, for what it is, we are going to underinvest and underperform systematically from now onward.
Okay, well, maybe we stop there because those were excellent and inspirational words. Unless you want to say a few final words, I think this panel really raised some very important issues about looking at the net effects across programs, not focusing only on program by program kinds of evaluations, on usability, on checks and balances too, because Sekar said to us, many people are just reading op-eds. So we out here in the peanut gallery have to keep on bringing evidence to decision makers in lots of different ways, not just through the official organizations that have this as their mandate. But over to you, Marie, for final thoughts.
Yeah, no, I would like just to really thank first of all, CGD and the panel for amazing insights. I think this is a discussion to be continued. I think some of the challenges on, especially around the culture that we talked about here, and how we, how this becomes, critical thinking and the use of evidence becomes everybody's business. It doesn't mean everybody needs to be a systematic review expert, etc. We realize that there's specialization, but getting the sort of the thought, the critical mindsets that we want everybody to have when working in development. And I think beyond I think very good point that Ariana and several talked about in terms of the amount of funding, and this is an investment, as you just said, but also it's not only the amounts, but it's also about making it easy for all of those champions out there who actually want to do this work to be able to do it and not have to go out and hunt for those funds in addition to do this work. That is an inefficiency over and beyond